Okay, so in this first lecture, I want to start talking about utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is the first of the major moral theories we're going to talk about in this class. Um, Utilitarianism, natural law theory, Kantianism, virtue theory, those will be the really important moral theories. Um, Now, one thing you guys are going to notice is that all of these theories are going to have some problems. All of these theories are also going to have some advantages. We'll see that with utilitarianism. That will be the case with all of these theories. All of them have some real selling points. None of them are going to be perfect. So what I want to do in this utilitarianism lecture, this first one is just to lay out the basics of utilitarian reasoning. What the theory is, how it's supposed to work. Now, one thing you guys are going to notice is that the actual utilitarian theory, the utilitarian form of reasoning, is not going to be super complicated. It's actually pretty easy to understand what utilitarianism is, how it works. So we're actually going to put that out on the table in this first lecture. By the end of this lecture, definitely by the end of the next one, I think you guys will have a good sense of how the theory works. So you might be asking, well, if we can understand the theory in a couple of lectures, why do you have several more lectures? Well, the answer is that there are a lot of objections to utilitarianism. You guys will notice in Mill's essay, he spends, gets the theory on the table pretty quickly. He spends a lot of time addressing possible objections to utilitarianism. And so that's what we're going to do in a lot of the lectures. We're going to talk about, once we have the theory on the table, what are the possible objections to it? How does Mill try to handle them? How might we handle them? How serious are these objections? And how might a utilitarian react? Okay, but of course, before starting in on any of that, it's important to know what utilitarianism actually is. And utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. If I were in front of a whiteboard, I would, might even have one of those little like descending trees. Utilitarianism is consequentialism is a whole family of theories. Utilitarianism is just one theory under this consequentialist heading. Now, having said that, utilitarianism is by far the most important form of consequentialism, so much so that people honestly don't tend to talk about the other forms of consequentialism. We won't talk about them. We'll focus on utilitarianism. Okay, but so what is consequentialism? I think that's important to know before we get into utilitarianism. Well, consequentialism is an approach to morality that says basically the right action is the one that has the best consequences. So what does that mean? Well, here's the thing. I'm going to guess that all of you, every single one of you, have approached moral dilemmas as a consequentialist might. Let me give you an example. This is a pretty common sense, pretty normal form of moral thinking, right? So here's a case from, American history, fairly overlooked one, but back in the 70s, America had this space station, Skylab. So they did a lot of scientific research there, but then they abandoned the thing. It was getting old. Not only was it getting old, its orbit was decaying. It was going to come down. So Skylab's completely abandoned. Well, but it's going to crash out of the sky, right? And so the guys at NASA had this choice. Well, if they don't do anything, Skylab will come down over Southern California. But there's still a little bit of fuel in the tanks of this, this space station. If they use it, if they fire the thrusters, they can keep it in the air a little longer. If they do that, it'll come down probably over the Pacific Ocean. But even if it doesn't come down over the Pacific Ocean, if the worst case scenario is it lands in the Australian outback. Now, I gave this case to my, in-person class a while back, one of my students, very cynical guy, said, well, I know what NASA did, right? You know, we don't want it coming down over America, we're going to have it come down over Australia. He was right. That is what NASA did. But think about this, right? Think about what the morally right thing to do is. And look, it's kind of hard to say that what NASA did isn't the morally right thing. I'm guessing that most of you guys, if you were making this choice simply on what you think is the morally right thing, you'd fire the thrusters. Why? Well, look, there are a lot more people in Southern California. If it comes down over LA and San Diego, there's a lot more chance that, what's left of this space station might hurt people. If it comes down over the Pacific, well, nobody's going to die, right? If it comes down over the Australian outback, not many people live there. So, best consequences, keep this thing in the sky, right? In case you're interested, part of it did come down over Australia. Nobody was hurt. The Australians were not happy, though, you can guess. Or think of another case, right? Imagine that you are a doctor and you have 3 people come in who've been poisoned, right? They somehow got into this poison, you don't know how, but one person got a lot more of it than the other 2. They're all going to die if they don't get the antidote, but he needs a lot more of it than the other 2. Turns out, to save the one person, you'd have to use all the antidote you have on hand, let the other 2 die. Well, but you could, if you let this person die, you could save the other 2 since they got a lower dose. What would you do, right? Well, just sketching the case that way, everyone, I'm guessing, probably would say, save the 2, let the other one die. Better consequences if you let the one person die and save 2. All right, so hopefully you guys get a sense. Consequentialism is a very common sense, very normal way of thinking about morality, and a very common sense way of approaching moral choices. Well, here's the thing, though, and this is where utilitarianism really gets off the ground, right? In a lot of cases, it's pretty obvious what good consequences are and what are bad consequences, right? But if I make the case more complicated, it isn't, right? Let's fill in a bit more detail with my poison case, right? Let's imagine the person who got the heavy dose. Well, let's imagine he's 19, right? Let's imagine that the people who got the lighter dose, they're both in their 60s. What would you do then, right? Is it really, if we tweak the case in this way, look, I'm not saying kill the old people. I'm getting old myself, I'm less confident about those judgments. But I'm going to guess you wouldn't be so sure about it, right? So where utilitarianism gets going is this thought that we need to work out a more exact, a more precise way of saying what good and bad consequences are. And just as an aside before I move on, I want to note to you guys that, look, my poison example is a very simplified, very almost science fiction example, but real world cases of this sort do arise, right? Look, when they first came up with the dialysis machine, could save people whose kidneys had failed. Well, they didn't have enough of them, so they had to decide who gets dialysis, who doesn't. Another case, well, they've thought about what if there's a flu pandemic, a massive outbreak of some really deadly form of flu, who gets the ventilators, right? So these questions about what are good and bad consequences, they have real-world impacts. Okay, anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. Let's move on to what utilitarianism actually says, though. So as I said, utilitarianism works out a more exact idea of what good consequences are. And there's a lot of ways to approach this, but I think the best way to think about what utilitarianism is to think about 2 sets of questions and to see how utilitarianism answers those questions. So first question or set of questions, what is good or what is good for somebody? What makes people's lives go well? What is it that makes your life go well? What is it that if you have more of it, your life is better? If you have less of it, your life is not so good? Second question, whose good should we care about? So if we answer the first question, what makes people's lives go well? What's good for them? We still have to answer, well, whose good should we care about? Who is important? Well, here's how the utilitarian answers both questions. What is good? What makes someone's life go well? Happiness. And you might be saying to yourself, well, okay, that doesn't really tell me much. What in the world is happiness? And the utilitarian says happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain. And you want to be clear what the utilitarian means by this. The utilitarian means by pleasure anything that people find pleasant, anything that they like. So of course the utilitarian would factor in laying on the beach in the sun, good food, sex, drink, that kind of stuff, all that's pleasure, right? But they would also factor in stuff like, if you enjoy doing Sudoku puzzles, that's pleasure. If you enjoy listening to music, that's pleasure. One of my students from a few semesters ago, she talked about how much she enjoyed doing her accounting homework. That's a little weird to me. But if she really enjoys doing her accounting homework, that's pleasure for her. She's a lucky person. What she enjoys seems like it's going to pay pretty well. I can only envy her. Pain is anything people find unpleasant, right? You burn your hand on a stove, that's pain. You twist your ankle, that's pain. You have a headache, that's pain. But for a utilitarian, other stuff that people find unpleasant is also pain. If you're stressed out about something, that's pain. If you're angry about something, that's pain. If you are bored, that is pain for the utilitarian. So you want the most pleasure and the least pain. That's what makes someone's life go well. The more pleasure you have in your life, the better your life goes. The more pain you have, the worse your life goes. The less pain you have, the better it goes. More pleasure, better. Less pleasure, worse. And now look, one thing I think is important to note here is that the utilitarian is going to say pleasure and the absence of pain in the long term. It's important to note that to head off some kind of stupid objections to the utilitarian, right? Because someone might say, well, look, you utilitarians say happiness is pleasure in the absence of pain, but let's imagine someone who does heroin, right? Heroin's really pleasant, so I'm told. I've never done heroin. But, heroin's not going to make you happy for the obvious reasons, right? And the utilitarian would say, of course. Heroin will bring you a lot of pleasure in the short term, but it will deprive you, if you become an addict, of a lot of pleasure in the future. It will cause you a lot of pain. Or to take a more down-to-earth example, you might say eating ice cream anytime you want is pleasure. That's not going to make you happy. It's not very good for you, right? And the utilitarian will say, of course, short-term pleasure, but you set yourself up for pain in the future. So happiness, pleasure, and the absence of pain in the long term. All right, hopefully you guys are clear on that. Hopefully the kinds of objections that I'm trying to deal with here. We'll come back to this first one because this is going to be important, especially in the last lecture when I talk about Nozick's objections to utilitarianism. We'll talk about whether we think this is a good answer to question 1 and whether the utilitarian defines happiness in a good way. I'll tell you guys, later in the semester, when we talk about virtue theory, Aristotle will say, well, you utilitarians are right. Happiness is what's important, but you're wrong in how you define happiness. Happiness is more than pleasure and the absence of pain. Anyway, set that aside for now, but do keep it in mind. This will be very important in the future. Okay, moving on. Second question, whose good should we care about? And the utilitarian will say we should care about everyone's good, and we should care about everyone's good equally. My pleasure, my pain matters no more, no less than yours, and I ought to care, ideally, just as much about your pleasure and your pain as I do my own. And we both should care as much about the pleasure and pain of someone half a world away as we do our own. Everyone's pleasure, everyone's pain counts for the same amount for the utilitarian. Okay, so this sets up the utilitarian definition of right and wrong. For the utilitarian, the right action is whatever creates the most overall happiness. Wrong actions are actions that create less happiness than is possible or more unhappiness. And I think here, the best way to understand this is to think of just a few common sense cases, right? So if you're a utilitarian, how would you account for the fact that murder is wrong? Killing another human being is generally wrong. Well, think about it this way, right? If someone kills another person, they deprive the person they kill of all future pleasure. Not only that, but when someone is killed, it ripples outwards. The person's family, the person's friends feel really unhappy. The community is really unhappy. All of that means that murder is going to create all this misery, deprive people of all this happiness. Even if the person who kills the other person really wants to kill them, they get some happiness from it, that's going to be outweighed by all the pleasure it deprives people of elsewhere, all the pain it creates. Or think of theft, right? Why would a utilitarian say it's wrong to steal something? I'll give you guys an example. Way back many years ago when I lived in Knoxville, when I moved to Knoxville, I hadn't lived in a city for a while. I left a GPS unit in my car. Yes, you can tell this was a few years ago. And lo and behold, my window gets smashed and the thing's taken, right? Why would a utilitarian say that that's wrong? Well, they'd say it's wrong because, look, it makes me unhappy that my window's smashed. I have to deal with that. All my neighbors, they see that my car got broken into. They all get scared. They worry their cars are going to get broken into. Everybody starts fighting to park their cars under the street lights. It might have made the person who stole it a little bit happy. He might have gotten some pleasure out of it. That is really outweighed by all the pain it creates elsewhere, all the pleasure it deprives people of, right? No better way to ruin an afternoon than waiting for the window guy while you're worriedly staring at clouds that look like they're going to pour at any second, right? I can tell you that from experience. Okay, but think about some exceptions to these cases, right? If you're a utilitarian, someone says, well, sometimes in some rare cases it might be morally acceptable to kill another person. Self-defense, maybe. How would you account for that, utilitarian? In some cases, it's okay to steal, right? If you need to steal to save your life, well, the utilitarian would say, well, think about it. I have a perfectly good answer to both of those. Imagine that there's an axe murderer out there, and he's going to axe murder you unless you kill him. Well, the utilitarian would say, think about consequences. It's likely to create the most overall happiness if it's him rather than you, right? You are a law-abiding citizen going about your business. He's an axe murderer. If he kills you, not only are you going to be dead, he's going to be free to axe murder more people. in this situation probably creates the most happiness if you're the one who survives and not him. Or stealing to survive. You know, again, imagine that you go hiking, you get lost, you've been lost for weeks, you come across a cabin, it has supplies, it maybe even has a radio, you can contact somebody to come save you, but you'd have to break in. Well, in this case, the utilitarian would say breaking and entering is the least bad course of action, right? You can prevent yourself from starving, you can maybe get help. Yes, you might make the owner of the cabin unhappy, but even if he's a really stingy, petty, awful person, he might really be angry you broke into his cabin, but that's going to be outweighed by the pain you save yourself from not starving to death, the pleasure you create by living on, right? So hopefully you guys get a sense of how utilitarianism is supposed to work. Now, one more thing I want to say about utilitarianism, and I think this is important because people often misunderstand this. A lot of times people will say, well, utilitarianism says to make the most people happy. That's usually true, but strictly speaking, that's not quite right. Utilitarian says do whatever creates the most overall happiness. Now, usually, that will be what makes the most people happy, but not always. Let me give you guys a case. Years ago, when I was in grad school, I had a friend, well, actually, I'm still friends with this guy, but he lives far away. But I had a friend, who was deathly allergic to peanuts. And this meant that a lot of the foods, a lot of restaurants were just off the table for this guy. Thai food was not an option. Indian food was not an option. So imagine that we're going out to dinner with this guy, Brian. Imagine there's me and some other person. We'll call him Bill. It's me, Bill, and Brian, right? And, well, Bill and I really want to get Thai food, and Brian says, well, I can't eat any of that. I'm just going to stare at you guys while you eat, not even touching anything because I'm afraid of dying. Let's go get a burger instead. Well, what would the utilitarian say the right thing to do is? Well, let's imagine that going and getting a burger makes me and Bill a little less happy. Well, getting Thai food might be what makes the most people happy, but the utilitarian would say, go get the burger, right? Why? Because the intensity of happiness and unhappiness matters too. Bill and I would be just a tiny bit less happy than if we had Thai, but Brian would be way happier than if we had Thai. So we sacrifice a little bit of happiness for each of us for a lot of happiness for Brian. So my point is here, numbers matter for the utilitarian, but intensity does as well. So, and actually, Mill doesn't really talk about this, but one of the more famous utilitarians, Jeremy Bentham, that he's kind of following does. You can almost think of a utilitarian calculus. Number of people affected by something times the intensity of the pleasure or pain times the duration. If it's pleasure, it's a good thing. More people affected, more intensity, more duration makes it better. If it's pain, it's bad. If you're a utilitarian, you can almost think of pleasure as the plus number, the number in black, pain as the red number, or the number with the minus in front. You want the black number or the number with the plus in front to come out as high as possible. Red number, number with a minus, as low as possible. Okay, so that is the basic utilitarian theory. I hope you guys understand it. I hope that makes, don't worry. We'll talk a lot more about the theory, about how to apply it in future lectures and in your case studies, but I hope the basic idea makes sense to y'all. Because what I want to do in future lectures is to talk about the objections to the theory and utilitarian answers. So I think a good way to end this lecture, I'm not going to go into any depth with these, but is to say just a little something at least to list the main objections to utilitarianism. So I'm just going to go through these really quickly. I'll go into more depth. Trust me, I will go into a lot more depth with all of these in future lectures. But let's just get them on the table. Let's just list them. So first objection, we cannot really know what the consequences of our actions are. Utilitarian says do whatever has the best consequences, creates the most happiness. Well, what if we can't know the consequences of our actions? 2, in the real world, we don't have time to calculate. Is it realistic to expect people to stand around asking themselves what's going to create the most happiness? This objection says no. 3, what Mill calls bad faith. The idea is that by using utilitarian reasoning, you can justify doing some bad or shabby things. Utilitarianism can justify really bad behavior, the objection says. 4, utilitarianism calls for too much in the way of sacrifice. The objection here is, well, look, any moral theory is going to ask us to make some sacrifices, but utilitarianism is going to ask too much. 6, consequences are not the only thing that matters. We'll go into more depth with this. There's several different ways you can take 6, but this will be a really important one. Oh, and sorry, I skipped over one. 5, utilitarianism does badly with fairness and respect for persons. The idea here is being fair, treating similar cases in the same way, treating people in the same way is important, and also this idea of respect for persons is going to be there's certain things we should never do to another human being no matter what. Utilitarianism is going to have some trouble accounting for fairness, accounting for respect for persons. So we'll talk about all of these. I'm going to tip my hand a little bit, and I'm going to say that I've listed these in the order I have because I think they get more serious as you go down the list. 1 through 3, I think utilitarians have pretty good answers for. 4 through 6, I think are more serious. But we'll talk about those points in future lectures. So that's it for today. Just get utilitarianism on the table. Take a glance at the possible objections.